Why is a small region with a population of only 1.5 million so dangerous for Russia? And how does it relate to the war in Ukraine? Is it possible that Kadyrov is the future dictator of Russia? Why does the Russian government allocate 30 billion rubles a year for the financing of the people of Chechnya, buying itself security guarantees? In this video, I'll also tell you how the former president of Chechnya, Dudayev, is connected to my home country, Estonia, and my personal family lineage, my grandfather. And why does Russia want to maintain control over Chechnya? The reason is quite simple and typical for Russia. But if I name it right away, you won't get the full story. So let's briskly journey through the history of the region to understand why it's a ticking time bomb for Russia. My friends, this video wouldn't be possible without these amazing animations, and they are done by animation studio called Fill the Gaps, who is led by the guy Phil himself. He's a French-German 3D animation expert, and he has done these high-quality, dynamic, engaging animations for us. Thank you, Phil. Without your help, this video couldn't be so awesome. Phil's information is in the description below. X, Instagram, YouTube, homepage, everything. Go and check out Fill the Gaps. And thank you for making this video so cool. Chechnya, nestled in the heart of the North Caucasus, has a history stretching back to the Paleolithic era. For centuries, the Vainoks, ancestors of modern Chechens and Ingushets, called this place home. Don't worry, the historical bit will be quick. The region crisscrossed by the Silk Road was a bustling trade hub. Goods from Persia, the Middle East, and Central Asia passed through. But over time, empires like the Achaemenids and the Sassanids eyed it greedily as a buffer zone against northern nomads. And just when things were settling down, the Mongols barged in during the 13th century, pushing the Chechens up into the mountains. That's when the Highlander identity began to take place, along with periodic skirmishes for wells, cattle, and pastures. Sounds peaceful, right? Then came the Ottomans, who saw the region as their northern gateway. Relax, my friends, we're almost done with the history lesson. The Russian-Turkish wars of the 18th and 19th century turned the North Caucasus into a chessboard. Chechnya was smack in the middle, caught between Ottoman-backed resistance and Russia's imperial ambitions. Islam became a rallying cry for the resistance against Russia, a trend Ramzan Kadyrov later tapped into. But the lack of centralized leadership among the Caucasian peoples made a unified front impossible. The Chechens relied on family clans and councils of elders to govern themselves, resisting Russian control even as the empire rolled in by 1959. Russia's victory in the Caucasian War didn't mean peace, it meant occupation. The empire established Cossack settlements as footholds and imposed policy of Russification, particularly on the lowland Chechens. The Highlanders, however, weren't having it, launching periodic raids into Russian forts well into the late 19th century. By then, Chechenya's economy was mainly agricultural, with minimal administrative structures. Life was tough, but the spirit of resistance remained strong. Fast forward to the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the North Caucasus erupted into civil war. Amid the chaos, Chechnya briefly declared itself the North Caucasian Emirate, an Islamic state, before the Bolsheviks came knocking. By the 1920s, the region became the Chechen-Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. World War II saw German troops make a failed bid for Grozny. Stalin's deportations of the Chechens to Kazakhstan in 1944 left a deep scar. Only in 1957 were they allowed to return, but the trauma lingered, much like Estonia, Ukraine, and other nations under Soviet repression. As in any Soviet country, religion in Chechnya was banned. However, during the era of perestroika, the re-Islamization of Chechnya began. By 1988, the Islamic Institute was established, and in 1991, the spiritual administration of Muslims of the Chechen Republic opened its doors. National sentiments were on the rise, as they were across the former USSR. The Baltics, the Caucasus, and many others felt the winds of change blowing. carrying with them a newfound sense of freedom. It was during this time that the name Dzhokhar Dudayev began to emerge. Born on February 15, 1944, in a small village, Dzhokhar was the 13th child in his family. Clearly his parents were playing the long game. Just 8 days after his birth, Stalin's repressions saw his family deported to Kazakhstan. Only in 1957, after the rehabilitation of the Chechen people, were they allowed to return to Chechenization. Dzhokhar proved to be an exceptional student, eventually graduating from the Tambov flight school and becoming a commander in the Soviet Air Force. Dzhokhar Dudayev remains a polarizing figure. He fiercely pursued Chechnya's independence, understood Russia, and knew how to resist it. Yet his armed groups, such as those under Shamil Basayev, often resorted to terrorism and displayed exceptional cruelty. That said, it was Russia that brought the war and destruction to Chechnya. During the Chechen War, the Chechens fought for their independence against a massive, albeit weakened, enemy. Guerrilla tactics and sheer audacity were the ways to survive. Dudayev was in many ways a man of his time. The real terrorists, as history shows, would later rise to power under the Russian FSB's influence. Dudayev supported the independence struggles of the Baltic states and led the fight for Chechnya's sovereignty. Dudayev served as a commander in the Soviet Air Force, a career that included a controversial chapter during the Soviet-Afghan War where he led bombing campaigns. An incredible dark mark on his biography. By 1989, he achieved the rank of Major General, becoming the first Chechen to reach this level in the Soviet military hierarchy. During the Perestroika years, he commanded a heavy bomber division based in Tartu, Estonia, my hometown. In Estonia, Dudayev became a local hero when he defied Kremlin's order to block the TV tower and parliament on Toompea Hill, preventing violence during Estonia's fight for independence. Connecting to this very same defying of Kremlin's orders, I have a personal story about it and I'll tell it to you. The story dates back to the singing revolution years of the Estonian struggle for freedom. My grandfather, Ants Paju, was in the Central Committee of Estonian SSR back then, and in 1991, on the 20th of August, that committee decided to put their lives on the line and hold a vote to declare an independent state of Estonia. My grandfather voted for freedom and democracy at the time when there were 25,000 Soviet troops stationed all over Estonia. The very next morning, orders came from the Kremlin and these 25,000 troops were ordered on high alert. The 76th Air Assault Division from Pskov, right on the modern-day border of Estonia and Russia, was ordered to enter into now free Estonia and take over the TV tower in Tallinn. Back then, controlling the radio and TV tower meant controlling the information in and out of Estonian capital. On the morning of 21st of August, so the next day, those Soviet elite troops tried to enter the TV tower in Tallinn, but were blockaded by a massive crowd of Estonians who gathered to defend the TV tower, with nothing else but their bodies. Soviet tanks faced off against Estonian men, women, grandfathers, grandmothers, who stood in front of the tanks, arms linked together, ready to die. Everyone waited for the orders that surely should arrive from the Kremlin, to ride over the people. There would be hundreds of casualties. That 76th Air Assault Division was led by none other than Dzhokhar Dudayev from Chechnya. My grandfather had been personal friends with Dudayev for quite some time by that point. The Kremlin gave Dudayev clear-cut orders. Ride over those pesky Estonians, no matter the casualties, and take control of that TV tower. Dudayev, having seen the Soviet terror on Chechen territory, understood the Estonian dream for a free and independent state. He called my grandfather, Ants Paju, to inform him about Kremlin's orders, and the two men talked. And it became very clear that they share a grudge against the Soviets. Dudayev, having seen thousands of Chechens being deported and my grandfather being deported himself to Siberia by the Soviets when he was only 4 years old. It fell upon Dudayev to undo the newly proclaimed free Estonia, and he decided to defy Kremlin's orders. Thanks to Dudayev, no Soviet tank drove over the unarmed civilians that morning. Dudayev ordered his troops to stand down and return to base. His refusal to suppress the Estonian people and his open support for Boris Yeltsin, his future nemesis, effectively ended his Soviet military career. In May, the retired general returned to Chechen Ingushetia to lead a growing social movement. In many ways, he drew on his Estonian experience where the first popular fronts had emerged years before independence was restored. In 1990, Dudayev even arranged for the blue, black and white Estonian flag to fly from a military aircraft over Tartu. Estonians, stunned, gazed at the sky, shaking hands and marveling at the sight. While Estonia's independence was bloodless, other places, Lithuania, Chechnya, Georgia, were not so fortunate. In January 1991, during clashes between independence supporters and Soviet troops in Lithuania, 15 people were killed and over 700 were injured. Across the collapsing USSR, control over parliament and media became the ultimate prize, fueling takeovers of TV centers and government buildings. After the tragic events in Vilnius, Lithuania, Dudayev famously declared on Estonian radio that if Soviet troops entered Estonia, he would deny them access to the airspace. Thanks to his decisive stance, Estonia avoided the bloody scenarios that unfolded elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Vilnius, the defense of the Lithuanian parliament received support from far and wide, including the United States. And it was not just moral support through speeches by Western politicians, but also direct contributions to the struggle. Andrew Eva, an American and former US Army Green Beret, actively participated in the January events, staying in the Supreme Council building, preparing Molotov cocktails and helping protesters gather firearms to defend against Soviet troops. The chaotic and violent struggle for power seen in Lithuania was mirrored in Chechnya, where the fight for independence and control over key institutions became equally fierce and defining. After Dudayev's return to his homeland, he continued the fight for his country and independence, drawing much inspiration from the Baltic states. Temporary government of the executive committee headed by Dudayev was created in Chechnya after the armed seizure of the television center and the house of radio by Dudayev's detachments. The new Chechen Republic of Ichkeria announced its succession from Russia. Ingushetia, on the other hand, remained part of the Russian Federation. On October 27, 1991, presidential elections were held in the Chechen part, which were won by Dzhokhar Dudayev. By his first decree, Dudayev proclaimed the independence of self-proclaimed Chechen Republic from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Oh, that's a mouthful. On November 7, 1991, the president of the RSFSR, I'm not going to say the full name again for you, Boris Yeltsin, issued a decree on the introduction of a state emergency in Chechnya. In response, Dudayev announced the introduction of martial law and ordered the creation of armed self-defense units. On November 9th, transport planes with Russian servicemen landed at the Kankala airport, but they were blockaded by Dudayev's armed men. As in all newly formed countries, the region's economy collapsed. Criminalization increased and numerous armed groups spiraled out of control. In December to February, the seizure of weapons abandoned by Russia continued. Although there was no particular need to capture them by force, because at that moment the Russian army was crumbling and Russian soldiers were stealing and selling weapons left and right, flooding the region and Russia itself with them. By the way, if you want more connection to that time frame, if you have seen the movie with Nicolas Cage, Lord of War, it's a fantastic movie, then this is exactly the time frame the movie happens in. Seeing that Russia was losing control over Chechnya, the Kremlin decided not to allow this. The FSB's playbook in tactics, missteps and heavy-handed methods has barely evolved. If researchers had paid closer attention to Chechen War, perhaps the events of 2008 in Georgia and the war in Ukraine could have been avoided. But the world, optimistic as ever, placed its bets on the supposed democratization of Russia, swallowing its narrative on the Chechen wars. And now, on to the main reasons Russia couldn't stomach the idea of an independent Chechnya. Oil. Lots of oil. In the North Caucasus, they didn't even need to dig deep. Oil would bubble up to the surface, forming lakes. Later, underground reservoirs were also discovered. Chechnya's independence could inspire the rest of the North Caucasus to break away, putting at risk Russia's control over oil and gas wealth, not to mention access to the Black Sea. Grozny's oil refinery, one of the oldest in the country, dates back to 1895, was one of the first in Russia to process crude. Back in the day, Terek Cossack army, which owned much of the land around Grozny, enjoyed the oil profits while the city itself lagged behind other Terek region settlements. In 1911, new oil fields were found and Russian and foreign entrepreneurs flooded in. By 1917, oil production hit 12 million barrels a year, a staggering figure for its time. But the Russian Civil War changed everything. Of 358 oil wells, only 29 remained operational. For a year and a half, the remaining wells burned, creating scenes reminiscent of Kuwait in 1991, just on a smaller scale. Production plummeted to 10% of pre-revolutionary levels. The Soviets nationalized the industry and began a slow recovery. But the profits went straight to Moscow, leaving the local population impoverished. Chechnya was once a major producer of oil products for the Soviet Union. Grozny even became the site where the Soviets manufactured their first polyethylene. I apologize if I'm butchering the name of that substance, polyethylene. Correct me in the comments. Naturally, this made the region a strategic target during World War II, with Germany attempting to seize it. In 1993, Moscow, unwilling to tolerate an independent Chechnya, launched efforts to bring it back under Russian control. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Sergei Shahrai and Minister for Ethnic Affairs Nikolai Yegorov devised a plan to overthrow Dudayev by supporting the pro-Russian opposition. Backed by Moscow's weapons and expertise, the opposition quickly became a Kremlin's puppet in the campaign to oust Dudayev. And the official reasons for these actions, you may ask? Protecting the rights of Russian citizens. A justification that feels all too familiar, doesn't it? Russia has used this excuse time and time again to legitimize its military interventions. However, the region remains explosive for Russia, and it's not because of any literal gas explosion, although there's plenty of that too. In the spring of 1993, tensions sharply escalated between President Dudayev and the parliament in the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. On April 17, 1993, Dudayev announced the dissolution of parliament, the Constitutional Court and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. On June 4th, armed Dudayev supporters under the command of Shamil Basayev seized the building of the Grozny City Council, where sessions of the Parliament and Constitutional Court were being held. Amendments were made to the constitution adopted in previous years, establishing a regime of personal power under Dudayev, which lasted until August 1994, when legislative powers were returned to the parliament. Russia provided financial support to opposition forces, supplied military equipment, and the Federal Counterintelligence Service of the Russian Federation recruited servicemen from the Russian army, often by transferring ordinary conscripts to contract service. Russians are always ready to kill for money. During the summer and autumn of 1994, the leader of opposition, Umar Avturkanov, received at least 150 billion rubles from Russia. Wow. How this money was spent remains unknown, but we can make a guess. In August 1994, Chechen Special Services detained an FSK colonel who had been involved in the operation, and if there was any doubts about Russia's involvement, they were completely dispelled after this. Russia-backed militias attempted to storm Grozny twice. The first attempt achieved some initial success, but ended with a retreat for unclear reasons, while the second attempt resulted in an outright and embarrassing failure. When overthrowing Dudayev through proxies didn't work, Moscow decided to send in big guns, literally. On November 30, 1994, Boris Yeltsin signed a secret decree to restore constitutional legality in Chechnya. By December 1st, combat aircraft were striking Chechen territory. These raids were conveniently carried out by unknown aircraft since the Air Force refused to confirm its involvement. On December 6th, Russian Defense Minister Pavel Grachev and Interior Minister Viktor Yerin met with Dudayev to propose a capitulation plan. Dudayev rejected it outright. 5 days later, Russian federal forces began their advance into Chechnya, marking the start of the First Chechen War. In a surreal twist, Moscow genuinely believed its propaganda. The report on the current situation was made by the Minister for National Affairs, Nikolai Yegorov. He said that, and I quote, "As a result of working with the population, we have made progress. 70% of Chechens are waiting for the Russian troops to enter. The other 30% are mostly neutral. Only renegades will resist." Viktor Medvedchuk made similar claims about Ukrainians greeting Russian troops with flowers before the 2022 full-scale invasion. History repeated itself, with the same FSB tactics, delusions and miscalculations. The parallels between Chechnya then and Ukraine now are chilling. The Russian army inflicted the same destruction on the Chechens as it does today on the Ukrainians, stoking age-old ethnic hatred. While there was less media coverage back then, the rare footage we do have is hauntingly similar to images of Mariupol, Bucha and other cities ravaged by war. On December 27, 1994, Russian President Boris Yeltsin addressed the nation about the situation in Chechnya. He claimed the Russian soldiers were defending the unity of Russia and insisted no region of Russia had the right to secede. Yeltsin declared Dudayev's government illegal, branding it a nest of criminals and separatists threatening Russian unity and the lives of its citizens. Sound familiar? Russia always justifies its interventions by claiming to protect the rights of the Russian people. Maybe Yeltsin and Putin had the same ghostwriter. At the time, Moscow's media machine painted Chechens as terrorists, and the Kremlin's imperial ambitions were brushed under the rug. From the start, the FSK fueled conflict in the region, plunging Chechnya into chaos. The region, already under interethnic tensions, spiraled into violence. Dudayev was seen as the main obstacle to Moscow's control, while Shamil Bazayev resorted to hostage-taking to force Russia into UN-mediated negotiations. Russia's response? Long and bloody sieges, particularly in Grozny, where the city was obliterated by artillery and airstrikes. Thousands of civilians lost their lives. Among the first casualties of the shelling on December 22nd was American journalist Cynthia Elba, who tragically lost her life while documenting the horrors. What set Dudayev apart from the other field commanders was his status as an international political figure. He was known globally, gave interviews to foreign journalists and held press conferences, and had personal experience negotiating with Russian leaders. Eliminating him required approval from the very top, Yeltsin himself. Dudayev survived multiple assassination attempts, but in the end, his satellite phone betrayed him. An A-50 reconnaissance plane, likely now residing at the bottom of the Black Sea, pinpointed his location. An Su-24 launched 2 missiles, and this time they hit the target. For many in Chechnya, Dudayev remains a hero who fought for their freedom. His death left the leadership of the Chechen independence movement empty. Russia's bombing campaigns left cities and industries in ruins. After capturing Grozny, they eventually had to retreat as Chechen fighters launched guerrilla attacks and sabotage missions. The economic crisis and the unpopularity of the war forced Russia to agree to truce. Troops withdrew, and the question of Chechenya's status was postponed until 2001. But peace didn't last long. Power struggles erupted among Dudayev's former allies, and radical Islamists advocating for a Sharia state took over. During this interwar period, most non-Chechens fled, and the local population lived in extreme poverty, often in war-damaged homes. Weapons flooded the region, criminal groups flourished, and unregulated local militias appeared in villages. Russia launched the second Chechen campaign under the guise of counter-terrorist operation, though in reality it wiped out anyone opposing Moscow or its allied clans. By 1999 to 2000, the Russian government, along with Ahmat Kadyrov's men, had removed the main obstacles to their control. Counter-terrorist operations were periodically declared in Chechnya, Dagestan and nearby regions. By the mid-2010s, the militant underground had been largely crushed and its leaders eliminated. However, these operations continued to pop up even in 2020s. The counter-terrorist operation regime was only lifted in 2021. According to Amnesty International, the Chechen War saw systematic human rights abuses committed by both Russian forces and Chechen militants. But how did the southern unrest affect Moscow? The Caucasus was once the USSR's fruit basket, supplying Moscow and other cities with watermelons, peaches, apricots and grapes. These luxuries rarely reached the ordinary citizens, instead filling the tables of party elites and KGB officers. Also, people from the region typically came to Moscow to study or work their way up the party ranks. There were countless of people from the Caucasus, artists, writers, musicians and film directors, who made an enormous contribution to the world's cultural heritage. But the very structure of the USSR always relied on the criminal underworld. Crime in the USSR had long been a shadow government, shaped during the Gulag era. If you want a deep dive into the Stalin's camps and the NKVD-influenced modern Russia, let me know in the comments below. Also subscribe and smash the like button. By 1980s, organized ethnic gangs in Ural prisons from the Caucasus, Georgia, Chechnya, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, grew powerful by controlling fruit routes, which they used to smuggle powder and weapons from Afghanistan. They also dabbled in currency fraud, theft and robbery. Afghanistan veterans, desperate for cash and unafraid to pull the trigger, joined these groups. After 10 years of war in Afghanistan and the collapse of the Soviet economy, Kalashnikovs were easier to buy than sausages. Crime flourished. Through it all, the KGB was always in on the action, collecting bribes and protecting crime bosses. Every major gangster had a KGB curator, feeding them intel for their turf wars and providing protection. Eventually, gangs from the Caucasus outmuscled the Slavic counterparts, who were too busy fighting among themselves. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the KGB officers and criminal gangs were the only ones with money. They became Russia's first investors, turning the 1990s into an era of violent turf wars as criminals fought over power and business. By 1999, Chechnya was a battleground divided between those who cooperated with Moscow for money and those who joined opposing militant groups. Clan rivalries over resources and illegal trade intensified, with terrorist groups from Afghanistan and Iran adding to the chaos. Weapons and drugs flowed freely. The main trigger for the Second Chechen War was the conflict between President Mashkadov's government and radical Islamists. Mashkadov's opponents accused him of working with Moscow, while Moscow viewed him as too weak to control the clans. In September 1999, Russia launched another special operation, bombing Chechens and Dagestan villages in pursuit of Wahhabis. Unable to establish control by force, Russia shifted to policy of Chechenization. In simpler terms, this wasn't just about transferring power to locals. It was about elevating and legitimizing those willing to do Russia's dirty work, even if it meant punishing their own people. The Kremlin saw these individuals as the perfect tools for its strategy. By June 2000, Ahmet Kadyrov, a former separatist leader and the father of today's Ramzan Don Kadyrov, was appointed head of Chechenya's administration. The rest, as they say, is history. Or maybe just the beginning of another chapter in Russia's long saga of control, chaos and conflict. Many of the so-called power structures in Chechnya today were created with the help of individuals who have committed serious crimes, including kidnappings and murders. Meanwhile, inter-clan struggles become as common as morning tea. The Chechen people were once again divided. Some collaborated with Russia, while others saw Russians as enemies. Ahmet Kadyrov, like most Chechen leaders of the time, didn't enjoy a long tenure. After a series of Kremlin-backed placeholders, Ramzan Kadyrov became president in February 2007. The FSB tightened its grip and the criminal underworld of the Caucasus fused even more deeply with the Kremlin and FSB's own shadowy dealings. Around this time, Chechens and Dagestanis became the go-to hitmen for contract killings ordered by Putin and the FSB. Journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who exposed Russia's actions in Chechnya, wrote, "Pro-Moscow detachment, though made up of Chechens, don't act based on ethnicity. Their enemies are personal, specific families or individuals they hold grudges against. For many Kadyrovites and others, siding with the federal forces isn't a political decision. It's just a convenient way to settle old scores with state backing." Tragically, Politkovskaya was assassinated in 2006 after surviving a poisoning attempt in 2004. A mercenary waited for her in her apartment building. Her address was supplied by an FSB lieutenant colonel. Critics of Putin and Ramzan Kadyrov, like Boris Nemtsov, met similar fates, with Nemtsov killed in plain sight near the Kremlin itself. The perpetrators never found. Political scientist Emil Payne described Kadyrov's Chechnya as an independent theocratic state masquerading as a loyal Russian region. In reality, it's a brutal dictatorship where Sharia law reigns, repression is the norm, and critics vanish without a trace. Even those living abroad are not safe, as Kadyrov's men and sometimes the FSB hunt them down. Now to the big question. Why is Chechnya a ticking time bomb for Russia? The answer lies in who runs the show. The Kremlin handed power to the ruthless criminals whose loyalty evaporates as soon as the money dries up. Chechnya's economy, including oil production, is in shambles, making it almost entirely dependent on Moscow. A staggering 84% of its budget comes from federal subsidies. While other regions see their funding cut, Chechnya subsidies keep increasing. Officially, the money is for reconstruction, but it usually ends up lining the pockets of the Kadyrov clan. Chechnya ranks among the top 4 recipients of subsidies behind Dagestan, Yakutia and Kamchatka. The rule of law doesn't exist. Kadyrov's enforcers keep the population in fear. Corruption runs rampant, and almost anything can be bought with the right price. From fake disability pensions to forged driver's licenses, creative business models thrive. One of the common schemes in Chechnya involves buying a disability certificate to qualify for a pension. The process is simple. A bribe is paid to the doctor, who issues the certificate, granting the person disability status and the 2-year pension. When the period ends, the process can be repeated with another bribe to renew its certificate. Essentially, the scheme pays for itself, and the many people in Chechnya rely on such arrangements to get by. The money comes from the Russian budget. Kadyrov also receives funds for military expenses, particularly for his Akhmat units. These units are notoriously selective about their duties. The Akhmat Chechnya battalion, for example, avoids combat, preferring to hang back as blocking squads to motivate Russian soldiers to advance. Kadyrov's army is often mocked as TikTok brigades in Ukraine, but it's enough to pose a real threat to the Kremlin if the opportunity arises. As the war in Ukraine drags on, Conditions in Russia are increasingly reminiscent of the chaotic 1990s. The country is awash with cheap weapons, ethnic gangs are forming within the military, and disputes over smuggling and stolen goods have already led to shootouts among Russian soldiers. The recent shootout at Wildberries Moscow office on September 18, 2024, between Chechen and Dagestani clans over the control of the business is a prime example of escalating tensions. Just weeks later, Kadyrov accused Dagestani officials of plotting his assassination and threatened them with blood feuds. Kadyrov's people are beginning to test the limits of Putin's regime. Events in Georgia and Syria send clear signals that Putin is losing his control over his satellite regions. His attempts to spark a broader Middle East conflict and involve Israel backfired spectacularly. Israel delivered crushing blows to Hezbollah, a group that had supported Assad's fight against Syrian rebels. While Hezbollah was distracted, the rebels supported by Turkey launched a counteroffensive in Syria. Russia's weakening grip is also fueling the rise of ISIS and other radical groups, not just in Syria but beyond. ISIS finds easy recruits among those who grew up in war-torn regions, enduring poverty, poor education and deep-seated resentment towards Russians. The North Caucasus, one of the poorest regions in Russian Federation, provides fertile ground for recruiting new members into terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, radicals are resurging in Syria, exploiting a power vacuum, and are unlikely to stop if they see opportunities to expand their influence beyond the region. The FSB, distracted by hunting traitors and silencing dissidents, has little capacity to deal with terrorists. Every new attack is conveniently blamed on Ukraine, while the actual perpetrators remain at large. Increasing violence, including attacks on law enforcement and high-profile incidents like the Crocus City assault, marks just the beginning. Centuries-old ethnic divisions and systematic oppressions fuel deep resentment. If Russia's economy collapses further, Kadyrov's clan and others will undoubtedly seize the opportunity. The chaotic 1990s taught us that veterans returning from war zones with no prospects often turn to crime. With today's economic crisis, a new wave of criminal activity is inevitable. Kadyrov is biding his time, saving his forces for when Russia's internal divisions reach a breaking point. While Russians fight among themselves, as they always did, more united minority groups may seize the advantage. A civil war in Russia seems inevitable, and it will likely begin in the North Caucasus. My friends, if you like this in-depth deep dive into Chechnya and its history, I can make more videos about it. You can just name the topic in the comments and I'll deliver it to you. Also, you can see it a little bit of a different style. No green screen, you can see the studio. I'm testing this out. So please do write feedback in the comments. What did you like? What did you not like? I want to make these videos by your liking. Also, I am able to do these videos thanks to Buy Me a Coffee monthly members. Everyone who is a monthly member in Buy Me a Coffee, write to me. I'll be sending you out this Rehi patch. Until my next video, my friends, Slava Ukraini, and bye-bye.